Today on the podcast, we're continuing our story of Walt Disney, Larry Watkin, and the initial wave of Disney live-action films in the 1950s. We are now up to the point where the studio is finishing and getting ready to market Darby O'Gill and the Little People. This film represents a departure from nearly all of the Disney live-action projects that came before it. Today we think of Disney live-action films as being focused on superheroes or fantasy adventures or contemporary dramas focused typically on children or teenagers. But back in the late 1950s, if you were a fan of Disney films, you would have thought of live-action Disney films as either historical dramas like Robin Hood or The Great Locomotive Chase, or animal adventures. The only Disney live-action film that existed outside of these categories at that time was 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, a science fiction epic. So not only was Disney in 1958 and 1959 beginning to change what a Disney live-action feature was, it also was creating a situation where its marketing and public relations team needed to change how its audiences understood what a Disney live-action production was. With Darby O'Gill, the Disney live-action projects now included fantasy adventures, special effects showcases, and projects that gestured toward musicals, as Darby would include both musical numbers and, down in the Kingdom of the Leprechauns, a highly choreographed dance number. So that's where we are with today's episode. We've talked about a number of other Disney film projects in this series. A while ago, I suggested that if you were to only watch or rewatch 2 or 3 of these films to understand how Disney moved through the decade, Treasure Island should be on that list, but another one should be Darby O'Gill, which is the film whose production we'll continue to explore in just a moment. But before we jump back into the world of 1958, I need to thank a few more Bandcamp subscribers. We're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. I am deeply grateful for each and every person who supports us over on Bandcamp, because without them, this podcast would simply cease to exist. Thanks today are going out to new subscribers: Mark, Elwood, Chari829, and Speedy C. Thanks to each of you for supporting all we do here. And now let's circle back down into the world of the Disney studio as production crews work to finish one of the most memorable live-action productions overseen by Walt, Darby O'Gill, and the Little People. As Darby O'Gill moved through production, some longtime Disney employees started to see that the film's lead character, the elderly Darby, was in certain ways similar to Walt himself. Though Walt was not yet 60, he was starting to move toward old age. This shift could be seen in the way he walked around the studio with one leg, occasionally giving him a little trouble. It could be seen in thin, crepe paper-like wrinkles that lined the skin around his eyes and his neck, and it could be seen in his hair. Hair that the studio lightly dyed for each TV appearance to hide small streaks of gray. The similarities, however, extended far beyond age. Darby was a man drawn to fantasy, a man who also held a nostalgia for the recent past. He enjoyed the simplicity of previous decades and found great enjoyment in stories of spirits and fairy folk. Walt held both of these qualities. His recent live-action films were largely historical dramas, many of which were set in the 1800s or the early 1900s, and Walt, of course, loved the exploration of fantasy, as was apparent in animated films he'd created over the years. As Disney producer Bill Anderson observed, Walt loved Darby O'Gill. He could identify with Darby, the character. Darby O'Gill, as it turned out, would be the first of many films that included a father figure who held some of Walt's personality. These films were often developed in the fashion of Darby O'Gill in that they were slowly pieced together over many years until Walt saw an emotional center in the project to which he could relate. The Absent-Minded Professor, a project that was developed over a decade at the studio, included the character of Ned Brainerd, a likable, if obsessive man who created wonders accompanied by his dog in his home workshop, much in the same way that Walt created the wonders of his miniature train, often accompanied by his dog in his home workshop. In Mary Poppins, another film developed over many years, the character that embodied some of Walt's personality was Mr. Banks, a person who learned that childhood play was the secret to joy and family success. In that film, David Tomlinson, the actor who played Mr. Banks, sported a thin mustache, so the character even looked a little like Walt. But these trends started with Darby O'Gill. In this way, in 1958, Walt was not only making a film about the fictional character of Darby O'Gill and the folklore of Ireland, he was making a film that in small ways was about himself as well, though these similarities would primarily be noticed by those close to him. Filming continued into summer. The days were long. Disney relied on a cultural advisor, Michael O'Hurley, to ensure that the visual presentation and the vocal presentation matched that of turn-of-the-century Ireland. Disney finished some of the more traditional sequences first, those that involved Darby and his cottage, walking through the village and at the bar. But even these took time. Take after take, Albert Sharp arranged his extremely expressive face into easily readable configurations of surprise and wonder as the camera focused in on him. Some of the actors not involved in the special effects sequences, such as Dennis O'Day, who played Father Murphy, finished their work in May, while others, such as Jimmy O'Day, who played the King of the Leprechauns, stayed on for additional weeks to complete the trick sequences. Some shots took hours to arrange, set up, light, and then film. The Leprechaun dance sequence took days to film. "It was tough going," Jimmy O'Day said, "particularly when I was working in a padded costume and heavy makeup." He explained that the light on the little people who were filmed far from the camera was 3 times the normal intensity of those lights on actors closer to the camera who played full-sized human characters. Throughout production, Janet Monroe managed to infuse her role with notes of warmth and subtle sexuality. She also played against the familiar role of the overbearing Irish woman who managed men around her, thereby bringing a sense of modern femininity to the role. Sean Connery, a dramatic actor, was nervous about the song he was required to sing. He believed that the director might overdub his voice with that of a trained singer once the filming was done, but in the end, his own voice was so natural and melodic that not only was it left in the film, it was released as a duet with Janet Monroe as a single. As production moved into its final days, Larry Watkin wrote a novelization of his screenplay for Dell Books. The cover would feature a still from the movie, but the interior text was pure Watkin. It would be the first time in 17 years that he had seen his name on the cover of a new work of fiction. On the Disney lot, as shots were printed and approved, footage was sent over to the effects animation department, where animator Josh Meader and others created sparks and spirit effects that would be placed onto the live-action images with an optical printer. The creation of these post-production effects was one reason the film wasn't released until nearly a year after filming wrapped up. During the early weeks of summer, filming continued on Soundstage 3, which contained the massive underground cave of the Little People. It also continued on the backlot Irish Village and at the Albertson Ranch, about a half hour from the studio, which doubled for the Irish countryside. Though Disney now had a small backlot with sets for Darby, Western Productions, and for the TV series Zorro, it lacked any sizable ranch area such as that owned by Fox or Paramount for extensive outdoor work, which meant that Disney was often renting out a movie ranch, typically at considerable expense. The production of Darby O'Gill was another reminder for company executives that the Disney studio, originally designed for the production of animation, still lacked key elements necessary for live-action production. Still, production of Darby O'Gill was finished in about 3 months, from the first day that Albert Sharp arrived at the studio to the day the camera took in its final image. Some of the actors, such as Jimmy O'Day, who played the King of the Leprechauns, and Jack McGowan, who also played a leprechaun, took the opportunity to see America before sailing home early in August from New York. When filming finished, some of the actors and crew such as Sean Connery headed home, and others such as Janet Monroe headed off to other Disney productions, such as Third Man on the Mountain, which would film for the rest of the summer in Switzerland. Albert Sharp, hoping the film might define his legacy, was among the last to leave, as his work involved 2 projects. He starred in the film. Also, he was featured in a TV special Walt wanted to create to promote the film. He didn't arrive back in Belfast until August 29th, making his stay in California almost 6 months. To promote the film for a general and family audience, Walt wanted Watkin to write a script for a TV episode that would playfully discuss how the film had been created, while also including a few clips from the film itself once those clips were finished in post-production. The episode, when aired, was called I Captured the King of the Leprechauns. In Watkin's hands, the script became part fantasy, part research overview. It starred Walt Disney, who played a slightly fictionalized version of himself. The script began with Walt talking to Irish actor Pat O'Brien about his desire to create a film about the fairy folk, a film that would have some drawing and animation alongside the live action. O'Brien suggested that drawings couldn't capture the complexities of the leprechauns, with all of their mischievous expressions and playful gestures. Only a leprechaun can play a leprechaun, he said, then advised Walt to go find the leprechauns for himself in Ireland. The script revised historical elements into a straightforward story that was easy to understand. For example, a conversation about developing a film loosely based on the Irish fairy folk, or rather many conversations about developing such a film, occurred in the mid to late 1940s, only not with Pat O'Brien. They happened with Roy Disney, Larry Watkin, and others. In this way, the script was an abridged and partially fictionalized retelling about how Walt and later Larry Watkin developed the film from the mid-1940s up through 1959, with the TV script condensing the work of many years into a string of short sequences suitable for Walt's weekly series. After the sequence with Pat O'Brien, Walt then visited a library in Ireland, or rather a stage dressed to look like a research library, to talk with a scholar devoted to the country's folklore, which was more or less what Walt and then later Watkin had done in the 1940s. But in this retelling of the script's development, Walt wasn't now just looking for story material, he was also looking for a leprechaun to appear in his film, an actual leprechaun, specifically the King of the Leprechauns. From there, Walt had traveled by train to a small village, much as Walt and later Watkin had done in their journeys. Home viewers saw the actual hills of Ireland, also a train passing through a field, spliced into the story about Walt, but the village at which Walt finally arrived was the one constructed on the Disney backlot, surrounded by hills and clouds created by matte painter Peter Allen Shaw, where Walt would then meet Darby O'Gill, a local storyteller who would help him better understand leprechaun culture. At this point, the TV script shifted entirely away from a fanciful retelling of how Walt and Watkin developed the film through research into a full-blown fantasy in which Walt Disney, playing a somewhat fictionalized character also called Walt Disney, worked with Darby O'Gill to capture the king of the leprechauns for his film. That the fictional producer on screen was a character called Walt Disney and was played by an actual producer whose real name was also Walt Disney only made the fantasy more believable, particularly for kids. Decades later, a script like this would have been called a postmodern adventure, in which a film blends fact with fantasy, a blending of fiction and nonfiction in which actors play roles that suggest but don't actually recreate their own lives. All of these storytelling tricks would be much later employed by more famous American authors such as Kurt Vonnegut and Tim O'Brien, authors respectively of the books Slaughterhouse-Five and The Things They Carried, but here back in 1958 and 1959, these tools were being test-driven by Larry Watkin and Walt Disney in an hour-long episode to promote a film. An episode that prefigured many of the narrative tricks that would be commonplace in American film and literature a decade or two later. After arriving at that small Irish village, Walt sits and listens to Darby O'Gill tell stories of the leprechauns. In this, there was another postmodern moment, again arranged before such touches were popular in film, in which Walt, himself a storyteller of fantasy, listens with wonder to another storyteller of fantasy, a character whose personality, in small ways, had been based on his own. Walt, of course, was quietly taken with his elderly doppelganger, but beyond Walt's attitude of admiration, any overt comparisons between Walt and Darby were left up to home viewers. The production of this TV episode presented Walt on the exact same sets where the feature had been or was being shot, including sets that incorporated enormous props. So the leprechauns, there's two in this episode who speak directly to Walt and Darby, appear roughly 1/4 the height of the two men. In this, again, Walt was creating a whimsical version of himself, a Walt Disney that was part truth and part invention. After Walt listened to some of Darby's stories and also talked with his friend Brian Connors, the king of the leprechauns, he offered them roles to play themselves in a movie that would recreate their experiences in Ireland. At the end of the TV episode, Walt returned to Burbank, where he met again with Irish-American actor Pat O'Brien. He explained that after visiting Ireland, he tore up the original version of the script to create a new one focused on Darby O'Gill, which is more or less what had happened in real life. A few years earlier, Watkin had abandoned the film's original conceit, which had mostly been based on the Kavanaugh stories, to create a new script that used a character of an elderly caretaker, a man who had recently lost his job, that Watkin had plucked from his own short story and reworked as a central element of the film. Though the feature itself wouldn't include any full-blown postmodern flourishes, it did include a small gesture to those ends, surely a nod to this TV episode. In the opening credits was a title card that read in Walt Disney's voice, "My thanks to King Brian of Knocknashiga and his leprechauns whose gracious cooperation made this picture possible." Once filming was complete, both for the feature and for the TV episode, the set for the Kingdom of the Leprechauns was struck from Soundstage 3. Unneeded lights were removed from the catwalk and placed in storage. Outdoors, Disney art directors redressed the Irish village as a Mexican settlement for an ongoing TV project, a miniseries called Texas John Slaughter, that would be shown on the weekly Disney TV show. In this way, Disney was again starting to function less like an animation studio and more like Warner Brothers or MGM, each of whom maintained massive backlot sets. As the film moved into post-production, activity at the studio focused more on promotion. Most everyone could see that this was a unique project, fact, it was a live-action film that, like many before it, embodied Walt's lifelong interest with stories from the British Isles. But apart from that, Darby O'Gill, in that it was a live-action fantasy with musical numbers, departed from the thematic tones of previous Disney live-action projects. By this point, the public mostly associated Disney live-action features with either historical dramas or nature documentaries. Anyone looking for a historical drama or a nature film would likely be disappointed in Darby O'Gill. Conversely, those wishing to see a musical fantasy might skip Darby, assuming it would be similar to recent Disney offerings. Darby O'Gill was a film that included the wonder and inventive spectacle that the public better associated with Disney animation, a film that perhaps suggested a new direction that the studio would develop in the coming years. The job of convincing the public that this film was different fell to the marketing team. The marketing department essentially needed to alert the public that this film wouldn't be anything like The Great Locomotive Chase or Treasure Island. The trailer was largely focused on the leprechaun scenes, as well as those with the Banshee and the Death Coach. It also featured part of one song, sung by Sean Connery and Janet Monroe, and the elaborate dance number featuring the leprechauns, both of which gestured in small ways to musicals. Though the concept of a musical fantasy would later become a familiar Disney touchstone, in 1959 this was new ground for the studio. Beyond the elements of music and wonder, the marketing team also believed that this film might find a large audience among Irish Americans, an often neglected segment of consumers who had deeply supported previous films focused on Ireland, such as The Quiet Man, which had been released with great success in 1952 by Warner Brothers. Well, unlike previous campaigns, Disney managers explained, Darby O'Gill will have a ready-made market potential of 20 million Irish Americans. Special attention will be paid to these people with shamrocks in their eyes. Their number alone could carry the picture to big box office earnings. Along with publicity pieces in large circulation newspapers and the usual mix of TV commercials, radio spots, and trailers, the team reached out to Irish American organizations and focused on cities with substantial Irish American populations, such as New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. Though initially Disney considered a February release date for the film, executives quickly bumped the date back to late June, a delay likely related to post-production efforts that were added to the presentation. But this delay also gave the marketing and public relations team additional time to promote the film. By the time the picture was shot and Watkin's additional work on the TV episode was over, he felt the soft hand of exhaustion pressed down on him. During these months, he had also done some revisions on another script, one about the first European Americans to travel down the Colorado River and into the Grand Canyon, a film called 10 Who Dared. Watkin had written the script a while ago, the last of his dramas for Walt about American history, but its production had been delayed until after Darby O'Gill. With this, Watkin had been writing and rewriting scripts for Walt for years, but it wasn't just the work. Most everyone in Hollywood could see that difficult times were ahead. The current contract between the Writers Guild and 56 Hollywood studios and production companies had expired in March. As TV exploded with popularity, the Guild now wanted its members to receive residuals for films and other material replayed on TV. They also wanted better benefits for its members. By spring, the Guild was holding meetings with members and exploring the possibility of a strike, one that had the potential to stop feature work in Hollywood. With these things unfolding around him, Watkin asked Walt if he might have time off to vacation with his wife, something that would be a true break from studio work and from Hollywood life in general. "I'd taken other respites," Watkin explained, but no matter where I had gone, I was always hunting a story or devoting half my time to a screenplay. I wanted to take my wife to Denmark and the surrounding country and spend a few days in London, at my own expense, of course, and with nothing on my mind but sightseeing. On this trip, he spent time in Scandinavia, one of the few corners of Europe that he hadn't researched for a Disney film. His children were now grown, and for Walt and various Disney projects, he had already explored England, Ireland, France, and Spain. With his wife, he walked the streets of Copenhagen, visited the parks, and wondered a little at all that he'd accomplished. He liked Denmark and the simplicity of life there. After a long visit, he planned to fly down to London and spend some time there, as that was the one overseas city that, after multiple UK productions, now felt to him like a second home. The premiere of Darby O'Gill appears to have been finalized fairly late in the promotion and marketing plan. The Disney studio may have been considering a more familiar venue for the premiere, such as Grauman's Chinese in Hollywood, but eventually arranged to premiere the film in Dublin at the historic Theatre Royal. Located in the heart of Dublin, not far from Trinity College and the National Gallery, the Theatre Royal was designed for both live productions and cinema. It was one of the largest venues in Europe, with 3,700 seats and standing room for another 300, a venue that, with the rise of television, now rarely filled its seats. It was the perfect place to present Darby O'Gill, a theater whose elaborate presence suggested show business traditions of earlier decades, which now would present a film that explored how the early folk stories of Ireland were passing away as well. Even if the theater was half empty for other events, Darby O'Gill would pack the seats, creating an elaborate Hollywood-style premiere, an event to raise money for disadvantaged children through the St. Vincent de Paul Society of Dublin. The first public notice of this premiere went out at the end of May, about a month before the premiere date. During these weeks, the studio tried to contact Larry Watkin and his wife, but didn't know exactly where they were staying in Denmark. By setting the premiere in Dublin and in creating a film about Irish culture, Disney managers, likely without realizing it, were venturing into a political issue that had been simmering in Ireland for years. For the previous 14 years, Ireland had slowly been mending official relations with Europe and North America. During World War II, Ireland had taken a position of neutrality in an attempt to avoid German air raids. Raids that then plagued England. With little military strength, Ireland saw the war as having the potential to decimate their country if the Nazis attacked them. In a 1941 telegram, the Secretary of Ireland's Department of External Affairs had said, "Existence of our own people comes before all other considerations. Ireland has been decimated and impoverished by wars and retains only the last remnant of her people and national heritage. Another war would make national survival impossible." Though Ireland maintained an official stance of neutrality, they did allow Allied forces access to Irish airspace during the war. They also gave Allied forces intelligence, including weather data, that was used to coordinate D-Day. In terms of military participation, however, Ireland maintained their position of neutrality for the duration of the war, even though some Irish citizens chose to fight with the British Army. Once the war was over, Ireland found its relations strained with former allies, such as the United States and Great Britain. Its position of neutrality also led members of the UN Security Council to repeatedly deny its application to join the relatively new organization. From 1946 to 1945, Ireland was effectively blocked out from UN membership. To overcome these problems, in the late 1940s and 1950s, the Irish government tried to demonstrate its political and cultural connections with the UK, Europe, and America. In this vein, some Irish officials now saw the presentation of Darby O'Gill an American film about Irish folklore, and its premiere in Dublin as two more steps toward rebuilding cultural and political ties with the States. What could better signal the general acceptance of Americans than the premiere of a new Disney film about leprechauns in Ireland? A few days before the premiere, in the middle of June, Walt and his wife Lily flew from California to London. There they ventured to the Dorchester Hotel, which was where Walt typically stayed when he was in the city. But he wasn't the only member of the Disney studio deeply familiar with the Dorchester, along with its nearby parks and restaurants. The Dorchester for years had also been a second home to Larry Watkin, a person so deeply involved with his vacation that he remained unaware of Darby O'Gill's upcoming premiere. "We had so completely forgotten about Disney," Watkin said, "that we were surprised when we checked into the Dorchester in London to find Walt and Lily and entourage ready to depart the next day for Dublin, where Darby O'Gill was opening shortly. Walt said he'd been trying to get in touch with me. Of course, Dot and I would have to attend the opening, so he called the London office to add us to the plane reservations, the hotel, and the rest of it." On the next day, the entire group would fly to Dublin, where they would participate in a themed spectacle, something assembled by the people of Dublin, which was the most lavish premiere for a Disney live-action film up until that time. The premiere would also have the overtones of a political event, signaling a strong connection between the people of Ireland and the artists of Hollywood. There would be a ballroom dressed as the Irish countryside, complete with plants, rocks, and sod. For waiters, there would be a team of young girls dressed as leprechauns, and throughout the day, Walt and the rest of the Disney team would meet with dignitaries and heads of state, acting essentially as unofficial ambassadors from the States. I'll be back next week with a new episode, one that will explore one of the most unique premieres during the lifetime of Walt, with many details taken from documents created in Ireland that haven't yet shown up in American publications. And also, though I know I've said this before, next week we should be able to wrap up this story about Walt Disney, Larry Watkin, and the early Disney live-action features. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us on Bandcamp as monthly supporters. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. So, until next week, this is Todd James Pierce.